Thank you. I'm delighted to be back at Yale with many old friends. My thanks to EP Director Frances Rosenbluth for the invitation, to Kellyanne Farnham, Charlotte Holman, Joelle Besch for excellent logistical support, and to all of you for coming. As you can hear, I have a bit of a cold, but if you are having trouble, let me know and I'll rip my throat out so you can hear me. So the overall title of these lectures is That Is Not Who We Are, Populism and Stories of Peoplehood. The title of this lecture is A Cacophony of Stories. And in the fall of 2018, around the globe, nothing is more striking than the increasing prominence and power of movements and leaders and political stories labeled populists. Journalists and scholars alike most often apply the term to anti-immigrant, authoritarian-leaning leaders and parties like Viktor Orban and Fidesz in Hungary, Sebastian Kurz in the Austrian People's Party, Geert Wilders in the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen and the National Front in France, the Law and Justice Party in Poland, the Danish People's Party, the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, the coalition government of the Five Star Movement and the Anti-Immigrant League in Italy, and many more. Populist often is also used to describe national authoritarian leaders like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, and sometimes Vladimir Putin in Russia and Xi Jinping in China. It's also applied to figures emphasizing religious conceptions of national identity, like Recep Tayyip Erdogan and the Justice and Development Party in Turkey, and Narendra Modi and the BJP in India. But the populist label is appended as well to more secular, economically left-leaning actors like Hugo Chavez and his troubled successor Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela, Alexis Tsipras and Syriza in Greece, and Thaksin and Yingluck Shinawatra in Thailand, as well as Bernie Sanders in the US, among others. Populist is a title coveted by many proponents of Brexit, such as Boris Johnson, and it's not only applied to, it's eagerly embraced by the current American president, Donald J. Trump. Not all of these populist leaders and movements are now in power, but in many places they are, and they are shaping political developments everywhere. In light of the variety of leaders and movements now being called populist, analysts have been devoting a great deal of attention to two questions. First, what the term populism really means, and second, what the causes of contemporary populism are, with the answers to the second question partly dependent on the first. Scholars have paid somewhat less attention to the topic that's my focus in these lectures, the question of what types of responses to pathological forms of populism are feasible and desirable. I will make a case for what the elements of desirable accounts of shared political identities, of good stories of peoplehood, are, because I contend these stories, along with other measures, are needed to combat the worst forms of populism today. To make that case, it will help first to review briefly the current scholarship on what we should call populism and what its causes may be. In recent public discourse on the what is populism question, perhaps the most influential view is Jan Werner Muller's in his appropriately entitled book, What is Populism? Muller has argued that populism is a moralized form of anti-pluralism, an inherently illiberal form of identity politics that is given to internal authoritarianism and allegiance to a leader believed to embody popular will. Muller rejects calling such populism pathological because he believes the pathology label implies that supporters of populist leaders are irrational with few reasonable grievances or goals. He acknowledges, however, that his definition is most descriptive of the contemporary populist movements in his native Europe and does not work well for the late 19th century American People's Parties and attendant movements that were the prime American examples of populism, at least prior to Trump. These movements were internally democratic, Often they embraced racial and ethnic minorities and women as equals, sometimes only rhetorically, but sometimes as leaders. They also did not follow an authoritarian figure. So I'm inclined to say against Muller that the American People's Party and many other self-proclaimed populist movements that are broadly democratic deserve to be called by the term that they wish to be called. So I do refer to strongly anti-pluralist, illiberal, and authoritarian populist movements as pathological forms of populism, not because I see their adherents as irrational, but because they are the variants of populism that are most likely to produce the ill effects with which Muller, I, and many others are concerned. They are the ones most likely to exclude, repress, and persecute ethnic and religious others, and to pursue the forms of constitutional self-governance while in actuality imposing dictatorships. For similar reasons, many scholars writing on populism adopt more expansive definitions than Muller. Perhaps the most influential in academic circles is Casmuda, often writing with Cristobal Kaltwasser. They've long argued for what they term a minimal definition of populism as a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic camps, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. For these authors, populist movements can be internally democratic without subservience to a leader claiming to embody that general will, though often such populist leaders arise. Yet others argue that even this definition goes too far. They contend that the people in populist movements need not be conceived as homogeneous, pure, or as possessing a Rousseauian general will. Many scholars, building on Ernesto Laclau, maintain that all that is required for a view or movement to be populist is an insistence, first, that politics is fundamentally about the clashes between the people and the elite, however defined, and second, that only the people can confer legitimacy on political and governmental actions. Similarly, many contributors to the recent Oxford Handbook of Populism see populism simply as a, quote, thin-centered ideology that posits a struggle between the will of the common people and a conspiring elite. This even more minimal definition allows us to deem populist both movements with left-leaning economic agendas, as in parts of Latin America and Greece today, and right-leaning, as well as more centrist ones. It also enables us to include internally democratic parties and movements that have embraced a significant degree of pluralism and have not followed an authoritarian leader, like the 19th century American People's Party. Because I prefer definitions that map onto actual usages in the world, I will use the Oxford Handbook's still more minimalist, expansive, and inclusive definition of populism here, with one important addition that I will specify shortly. But admittedly, using this broad definition makes responding to the second question, the causes of the contemporary surge in various movements, all labeled populist, even more challenging. The diverse streams of populism flowing in the world today are not likely all to be traceable to the same spring. However, analysts of modern populism actually are fairly united on the factors they discuss, though they disagree, sometimes sharply, on those factors' relative weight. Some emphasize economic concerns, including insecurities prompted by heightening inequalities and many dimensions of economic globalization, as well as technological innovations. These economic anxieties are often reinforced by perceptions that mainstream political parties and leaders are at best dismissive of poorer people's economic worries, and at worst, they're corrupt tools of wealthy elites. Other analysts, however, stress cultural factors, senses of loss of status and secure identity in the face of demographic and cultural shifts wrought by heightened immigration, secularization, minority liberation movements, and other trends. These scholars see populist adherents as enraged at cosmopolitan cultural elites, perceived to be contemptuous of more traditionalist beliefs and ways of life. At the extreme, moreover, many populists are seen as driven not just by cultural traditionalism, but virulent religious bigotry and racism. In their recent essay on the causes of populism, Kirk Hawkins, Madeline Reed, and Toon Pavel see force in both these strands of explanation. They also call, however, for greater attention to the content of populist ideas, the reasons people have for deciding that conspiring elites, whether economic or cultural or both, are ruining their lives. These scholars see populism as rooted in belief in democracy, faith in democracy, accompanied by the conviction that if things are bad, it must be that the leaders are failing the people, so that individuals become receptive to rhetorical frames that assign blame to elites. Like all these authors, I see great power in both the economic and cultural strands of explanation for the causes of contemporary populism. I will not focus on those causes here, but that is because I seek not to challenge prevailing accounts, only to add to them. In doing so, I will build on the argument that we should attend to the content of populist ideas, and that most populist supporters genuinely embrace conceptions of democracy, notions that the people rightly defined are the source of political legitimacy. However, I wish to take this concern with the content of populist ideas in a different direction than most analysts are doing. Hawkins, Reed, and Pobbles, for example, end up calling for more attention to the policy attitudes of popular voters in the manner of mainstream public opinion scholars. They do not examine whom different populist movements say are the people whose will and interest should govern, and why the people deserve to govern. They do not give much concrete attention, in short, to populist versions of what I call stories of peoplehood. Yet even though globalizing forces creating job displacements, economic inequalities, greater demographic diversity, heightened urbanization, and often senses of disempowerment all provide conditions conducive to populist revolts against new economic and cultural elites, those revolts are neither inevitable nor wholly self-actualizing. There are always elements of contingent political agency at work. Leaders must advance populist stories of peoplehood that persuade people to interpret their experiences in certain ways. They can do so in any number of ways, for better and worse. Consequently, failure to attend to the populist stories that political leaders are advancing on who the people are, how they are aggrieved, and what they should do can lead scholars to overlook both a significant contributing cause and a possible cure for pathological populisms today. That's why I want to add one element to the Oxford Handbook of Populism's minimalist definition of populism. I wish to insist that every populist ideology has some story explaining who the people are and why they are more deserving than elites, and that we must engage with these stories if we hope to render populist movements more genuinely democratic and respectful of the rights and dignity of all. So let's consider stories for a few minutes. In his international bestseller, *Sapiens*, the Israeli historian Yuval Harari argues that all large-scale forms of human cooperation, whether, quote, a modern state, a medieval church, an ancient city, or an archaic tribe, are rooted in people's collective imagination, in the stories that people tell one another. Harari believes that the unique feature of our species, Homo sapiens, and the real source of our species' ability to rule the world is our ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. He thinks that capacity for large-scale cooperation rests in turn on our abilities to compose and to embrace myths or stories of our common identities, interests, and purposes. It is shared belief in these stories that persuades us both that we can trust one another and that it would be worthwhile to help one another, in his words. Now, I'm not so bold to proclaim, like Harari, that our storytelling and story-believing abilities are what sets us Homo sapiens apart from and above all other species on Earth, including Neanderthals and mastodons. Still, I've long analyzed the politics of Homo sapiens very similarly. I've contended that political communities are always created and sustained by combinations of coercive force and persuasive stories, because, in Harari's words, one cannot organize an army solely by coercion. There must be some true believers among them if they are to be relied upon in conflicts. My focus has been on the stories of what I call political peoples, which I define as any and all human associations, groups, and communities that are commonly understood to assert that their members owe them a measure of allegiance against the demands of other associations, communities, and groups. The more demanding the claims, the more political the group. This definition means that there's a wide range of weaker and stronger forms of political peoplehood. I have also argued, like Harari, that stories of peoplehood work to inspire necessary senses of trust among fellow members of a community and between the members and their leaders, as well as senses of the worth of their community membership. I further contended that any story of political peoplehood to sustain senses of collective identity and cooperative endeavors over time must persuasively advance three basic themes, though it can do so with different emphases and different degrees of success. It must have an economic theme, promising both personal and collective material well-being. It must have a political power theme, promising both personal safety and community power sufficient for collective self-defense, as well as perhaps a significant measure of political voice. It must also have what I have termed a constitutive theme, one presenting membership in a particular community as intrinsic to who the members really are because of traits deemed to be normatively good. One of my core claims is that even though no political society is likely to endure if it does not have credible economic and political power themes with confirming results for a critical mass of its members, it's also true that no political society can long sustain itself through economic and political power benefits alone. It's not just economics and politics, there's the ethics part in EPE. There will inevitably be economic and political downtimes. That's why they're not enough. So political communities must also be maintained by senses of allegiance rooted in beliefs that being part of that community is part of its members' core identities and a part that gives their lives meaning and worth. Constitutive themes may feature religion, ancestry, ethnicity, race, gender roles, language, culture, class, customs, and more, but they always present the traits they feature as marks of high value and as integral to who we are. My previous discussions of stories of peoplehood have focused on these constitutive themes because they're not so commonly discussed, much less stressed in contemporary political science, which instead emphasizes economic and political power interests. I've also focused on nationalist stories of peoplehood, or stories of nationhood, because they remain the most prevalent and most demanding, the most likely to claim supreme authority with some real efficacy in today's world. But here I'll go further. A central claim I wish to make is that a contributing factor to the rise of modern populisms, particularly nationalistic populisms, has been a decline in genuinely hegemonic stories of peoplehood, combined with a proliferation of thematically very diverse and often conflicting stories of peoplehood. Some of these stories highlight economic benefits, some political power concerns, others a wide variety of constitutive themes. Some are nationalistic, but many are anti-nationalist, championing a great diversity of other possible memberships and allegiances. Collectively, they have generated a cacophony of stories of identities and obligations that many find painful today. This cacophony has made clear, simple, familiar nationalistic stories and slogans sound like siren songs to millions. Until recently, many analysts stressed to the contrary, that a variety of forms of globalization were producing greater economic, ideological, and cultural homogeneity, making the world flat, in Thomas Friedman's famous phrase. However, today many perceive a complex dialectic of globalization and fragmentation that is contributing to a massive proliferation of stories of political peoplehood that I see as in many ways exciting and promising, but that many see, and rightly see, as deeply unsettling. This dialectic arises, many scholars suggest, because globalization has fostered transnational economic communications, social and political networks and associations, but also and simultaneously new potential for many sub-communities to flourish without extensive reliance on a national state. That potential is all the more significant as contemporary projects of state building and state maintaining are often faltering, leading to estimates that up to 80% of the world's population resides in limited or failed states. So today's increasingly globalized yet increasingly fragmented world fosters countless rapidly proliferating rival stories of political peoplehood that challenge the dominance of narratives of national identity. But these conditions also provide motives and opportunities for proponents of nationalistic narratives to push back. To be sure, for as far back as we know, human beings have had what we would now term multiple identities, as bearers of certain genders, as family members, as adherents of religious communities, as practitioners of occupations, and as participants in political societies of various sorts, amongst other roles and statuses. But it's plausible to believe that through most of human history, few people felt routinely confronted by so many diverse and conflicting stories of what their core political peoplehood should be, as most persons are now. It is true that the capacities of Homo sapiens to create and communicate stories have enabled us for millennia to form notions of peoples and ways of life different from our own, but things have changed. In recent decades, modern communication systems, greater mobility, and urbanizing trends have significantly transformed most people's lives, shifting more and more of the world's population into extraordinarily diverse and extensively wired global cities, making exposure to multiple stories almost inescapable. In contrast, most people throughout most of human history lived most of their lives in relative isolation. Up through the end of World War II, more than 2/3 of the world's population lived in rural areas with limited access to mass communication systems. All through their lives, they mostly heard long familiar stories of who they were and might be, told by local, familial, religious, and political leaders. Even the higher political figures and broader communities that may have claimed authority over them seemed remote. Stories depicting identities and ways of life substantially different from those they were pursuing seem more like entertaining fantasies than concrete options that groups were urging them to pursue. The stories they heard, moreover, generally presented their multiple identities, their familial statuses, gender roles, occupations, religious memberships, and political allegiances as all mutually compatible, interwoven, and integrated into a relatively coherent sense of who they were and what they should be, a sense that most of those around them shared and reinforced. Few experienced frequent demands to reconsider or choose among their possible political identities and obligations. I don't mean that life was generally pastoral and peaceful. Conflicts and power struggles at all levels have been endemic throughout human history. However, conflicts can occur, and probably most routinely did occur, through people seeking to heighten the importance of their roles or to gain a higher station among the conventional roles and statuses defined with the prevailing narratives of their communities. Army commanders wanted to be emperors, barons wanted to be kings, but battles did not so often arise from clashes of narratives depicting what their political communities and who their core identities should be. Of course, political societies often did compete with other societies, with the disputes frequently settled by force. Conquerors often imposed on the conquered a new sense of their political identities, expressed in the victors' stories of political peoplehood. Still, up until roughly the last 400 years, most human beings lived in villages, small cities, or nomadic tribes that managed through winning occasional battles or through the collapse of any overarching authority to maintain or regain their autonomy, or else they were part of empires. Mostly, they were part of empires. Up through World War II and the ensuing era of decolonization, the bulk of the world's population was chiefly governed by imperial regimes of one sort or another, from the Assyrian Empire to the Persian to the sequence of Chinese empires, as well as the Roman, the Byzantine, the Arab Caliphate, the Ottoman, the Mughal, the Incan, the Aztec empires, the Spanish, French, and British empires, and many more. Yet the imperially governed were often loosely governed. Although these empires varied enormously in many respects, most had multi-level overlapping jurisdictions, and apart from collecting taxes and compelling military service, Most shared power with the local leaders they favored in the communities they conquered. They permitted considerable local self-governance that left a wide array of religions, occupations, ethnic identities, and cultural ways of life, and so a great variety of traditional identities relatively unchallenged. Consequently, though they propagated stories of imperial peoplehood that shaped the identities of those they ruled over time in significant ways, for many imperial subjects, this new political identity was a relatively unobtrusive layer added on to the familiar ones that continued to characterize who they were and what they did on most days of their lives. Even those who chose to resist their imperial conquerors generally did so out of a firm sense of their preceding traditional identities and obligations that enabled them to see their political world as a straightforward us versus them. Then came the global decolonization movements that followed World War II, the long period when empires were the most prevalent form of political regime around the globe gave way to a new era that we often treat as older than it really is. This is the era in which national states at last became the overwhelmingly predominant kind of political society around the globe, culminating a process that began in Europe in the earliest, the 16th century, and gained ideological impetus across the globe with the late 18th century American and French revolutions. Though exact numbers can vary with different definitions, the world possessed roughly 50 sovereign states in 1945 as World War II ended. By 1989, as the end of the European and Japanese empires in Africa and Asia especially generated a host of new national states, the number of states had more than tripled to over 180. For the first time, these sorts of states governed most of the world's population. Yet this multiplication of states did not foster experiences of fragmented and competing political identities to the degree that many are experiencing today for one major reason. This brave new world of national states displayed an overarching, indeed hegemonic structure, driven by the rivalry between the capitalist United States and its global allies and the communist Soviet Union and its allies. Many states, to be sure, were unaligned, and most states displayed some level of ongoing internal contestation over whether they should align in a different way than they were currently doing, especially those wrestling with the legacies of imperialism, which included many continuing forms of imperial influence. Even so, during the Cold War, the stories of political peoplehood that competed in most people's experience gained some simplicity and clarity from their answer to one great question: on which side of the Iron Curtain do we stand? The centrality of this divide helped states on both sides to accept new transnational agreements and institutions, including NATO on the one hand and the Warsaw Pact on the other, which they might otherwise have seen as reducing their national sovereignty. It also prompted support in much of the West for new pro-capitalist global economic institutions, including the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and eventually the World Trade Organization, even as communist nations like Cuba and North Korea relied on aid from the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. I grew up in this world, and I can attest that at a psychic level, it made choices about political identity, not just for states but for individuals, seem more straightforward than they do today. The threat of nuclear war was always in the background and often in the forefront of our minds, swallowing up all other differences and concerns, and thereby promoting relatively integrated senses of who we were. When in 1961, John F. Kennedy structured his inaugural address around the opposition between, in his words, two great and powerful groups of nations, both racing to alter that uncertain balance of terror that stays the hand of mankind's final war, he told a compelling story of global politics in which we all knew our place. Then in 1989, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union fell, launching another wave of post-imperial state building, so that today the UN has 195 member states. Like many other parts of past empires, the former Soviet satellite nations have often struggled to construct coherent, much less compelling, stories of peoplehood to replace the ones that prevailed when the lives of those involved were shaped by standing for or against an imperial regime or for or against the communist or capitalist bloc. Compounding these difficulties, These struggles have occurred in a context in which the dialectics of globalization and fragmentation means that most states are confronting rising numbers of persuasive alternative accounts of their would-be constituents' possible political memberships and obligations. Let me offer some examples. Up through 1989, one peculiar feature of many of the states that foregrounded communism in their stories of peoplehood, such as Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union itself, is that they also structured themselves as ethno-federal states with subdivisions and even personal identity cards that drew upon and reinforced pre-existing ethnocultural communities. They did so in part to elicit support for their political regimes beyond those that the economic and political power themes provided by communist ideologies could summon. When communism fell, these states faced choices about whether they should remain unitary states and about what sorts of national identities they should embrace. They responded in different ways. In 1990, the former Czechoslovak Socialist Republic first became the Czech and Slovak Federative Republic, and then in 1992 broke into two new states, the Czech and Slovak republics, the latter commonly called Slovakia. As Nadia Nedelsky has shown, the Czech Republic, like most of the former Soviet bloc states in the 1990s, adopted what is frequently termed a civic conception of their identity, stressing that their state was a federation of free and equal citizens dedicated to human rights and democracy. Slovakia instead chose what is often termed an ethnic conception of its identity. Its constitution identified itself as the product of the Slovak nation, exercising the natural right of nations to self-determination in order to advance the political and cultural heritage of our forefathers, while also allowing a place for minority nationalities living on its territories. Both republics, however, included some who retained a sense of their identities primarily as communists. Others remained loyal to the formerly united Czechoslovakia. Still others were actually more strongly attached to the kind of political identity proclaimed in the republic in which they did not reside than the one in which they did. Many more were simply left uncertain about who or what their political identities should be. In each of the new republics, moreover, national minorities expressed concerns that their new states would not adequately protect them against discrimination or recognize their distinctive identities. As a result, the members of both these new states faced a multiplicity of competing stories of their political peoplehood that were no longer subordinated under their membership in the Soviet bloc. The same has been true of many other formerly communist nations, some of which have swung between more civic and more ethnic national self-conceptions, like Hungary and Poland, and some of which have faced internal separatist movements, including Russia itself. Many of the new nations created by the decolonization movements earlier in the 20th century continue to face similar challenges, in part because so many have boundaries drawn by their imperial governors, not chosen by their indigenous residents. To take one striking example, although the Arab sheikdoms that now form part of the United Arab Emirates were never formally part of the British Empire, Great Britain long used treaties with their preferred sheiks to exercise extensive control over the region, especially after the discovery of oil in Bahrain in 1932. But in 1968, the British chose to withdraw from the Persian Gulf, instituting discussions amongst the British protected Gulf states that led in 1971 to the founding of the United Arab Emirates. As Calvert Jones, a Yale PhD, has detailed, this new political regime has, since its inception, faced major difficulties in fostering a sense of common national identity among its members. There simply was no historical shared Emirati identity upon which to build, not even a sense of common cause born of shared anti-colonial struggles. Most UAE residents had instead grown up with strong, distinct, and often conflicting tribal identities. However, the Emirates did have oil money, as well as inherited tribal customs in which rulers provided goods to their tribesmen. So it's not surprising that early on the UAE government sought to foster loyalty chiefly through an economic story of peoplehood. They told those they governed, in effect, if you embrace membership in the UAE, you will be eligible for state-provided benefits in the form of land, water, houses, clothing, shoes, foods, hospitals, vehicles, and more. It will immediately be clear, however, that purchasing national loyalty primarily through the provision of material goods is a problematic strategy. It's likely to produce innumerable claimants for membership, requiring sharp constraints on access to citizenship if citizens are indeed to receive extensive benefits. It can also foster a rentier mentality, an ethos of self-indulgent, often lazy dependency. By the 1990s, according to Jones, UAE rulers had become vividly conscious of just these problems. They also knew that reliance on oil could not last forever and that they would need new strategies to maintain economic success in a world increasingly dominated by global market and financial systems. They concluded they needed to craft a new kind of citizen, one capable of thriving and enabling the UAE to thrive in the global economy. But the Emirates' governing sheiks faced major challenges in doing so. They still had difficulty advancing any compelling ethno-cultural account of UAE identity. Their state remained historically recent, and though many of their citizens valued older tribal, pan-Arabic, or Muslim identities, too much emphasis on those allegiances could cut against national loyalties. Many proponents of those identities, especially Islamists, had frequently criticized the government's economic vision of Emirati peoplehood as a corrupt Western imposition, even as others attacked the Islamists for favoring foreign versions of Islam over Emirati traditions. So the ruling sheiks were understandably wary of aligning too greatly with movements trumpeting those ethno-cultural themes. Moreover, because the UAE does limit access to citizenship and its material benefits, even as it also relies extensively on immigrant labor, UAE citizens are a small privileged minority within the far larger and more diverse resident alien population of their own country. UAE elites consequently complain that it is difficult to foster a sense of Emirati cultural identity when, for example, so many children are raised by Filipino nannies. Nor can the regime easily rely on winning loyalty through political power stories, since their strength lies in wealth, not military force. And the Emirates monarchs do not wish to give most of their citizens, much less the other residents they rule, any real voice in government. As a result, the UAE's rulers had little choice but to try to tweak their economic themes, explaining why citizens should value belonging to the United Arab Emirates. They've sought to persuade their members that their citizenship is indeed a road to wealth, but wealth that should be gained by becoming loyal bourgeois citizens who display a vigorous entrepreneurial spirit with lots of self-reliance and initiative and a strong work ethic, to quote the government's 2010 strategic plan, UAE Vision 2021. Calvert Jones finds, however, that so far the UAE's pursuit of this vision has had very mixed success. Younger citizens all too often become what she calls entitled patriots. They are fully persuaded that they are exceptional people in an exceptional country that provides its citizens with paths to prosperity and status, but many still prefer to get wealth through government jobs rather than their own business startups. Those who do pursue entrepreneurial identities, moreover, and particularly those who do so successfully, often come to see themselves as primarily members of a transnational cosmopolitan community of global economic elites, rather than chiefly as dedicated UAE citizens. The inhabitants of many post-colonial regimes similarly find themselves confronting movements and groups advancing a variety of stories of who they are and where their allegiances should go, to older tribes, to states originally crafted by imperial rulers, to transnational co-ethnics or fellow religious believers, to global economic enterprises and endeavors, and much more. In such circumstances, it's not surprising that many find it hard to form a clear, sustaining sense of their political peoplehood. The complex challenges that the interactions of post-imperial state building, global economic and social networks, and colonial legacies pose for possessing secure political identities are also vividly illustrated by Jan Padios' new book, A Nation on the Line, which discusses national narratives in the Philippines. Her analysis encompasses Filipino nannies working in places like the UAE, but it focuses on what she calls the single most important social, cultural, and economic development in the country in the 21st century. Aided by state policies, the Philippines have become the call center capital of the world, surpassing India. By 2015, the Filipino call center industry generated roughly 7.5% of the nation's GDP and almost as much as the remittances of all overseas Filipino workers combined. Padios' research indicates that this major industry has been built in part through promotional narratives, stressing that the Philippines' historical status as an American colony has fostered Filipino capacities to speak American-style English and deep familiarity with American cultures. These skills enable its workers to perform call center services for American customers more effectively than the call centers of any other nation. Industry executives also contend that Filipinos excel in call center work because, just as their American colonial governments used to claim, they have innate cultural traits of compassion and warmth. As one business leader put it, we are good at working with the heart. Padios contends that until recently, the political and economic leaders of the Philippines wove these imperially shaped themes of their people's historical and cultural identities into a proud national claim that Filipinos are uniquely equipped to prosper in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century. They also promised that this new Philippines IT service economy would enable overseas Filipino workers, like those nannies in the UAE, in the United Arab Emirates, to return home and care for their own children. Yet these recent narratives stressing the cultural serviceability of Filipinos for Americans inevitably communicate a message of linked identity with, if not continuing dependence on, the United States. Though many Filipinos relish this story of their peoplehood, it can seem to present them as basically adjunct Americans, and so others find it alienating. It also has turned out there are limits to how far operating friendly call centers can take Filipino workers in the nation as a whole economically. So it's perhaps understandable that more recently an authoritarian nationalist populist, Rodrigo Duterte, has gained power and often deployed anti-American rhetoric while exploring a closer relationship with China, though most recently Duterte seems to have found a kindred spirit in President Trump. In different ways, then, the members of this post-colonial nation are experiencing shifting and contradictory economic, political, and cultural accounts of who they are and what their aspirations should be. Let me stress, however, that this experience of struggling with multiple conflicting stories of peoplehood is not at all confined to recent post-colonial societies. In the wake of the Cold War's end and the modern mix of globalization and fragmentation, competing senses of peoplehood have become more visible and politically significant in most well-established national regimes as well. Kathy Kramer's book, The Politics of Resentment, relies on extensive observation of informal conversations to grasp the political perspectives of rural Wisconsin citizens, many of whom voted first for the populist anti-establishment Republican Scott Walker for governor, and then for the still more pronouncedly so Donald Trump. Kramer finds that the rural consciousness prevalent in Wisconsin today has three major components that map well onto my framework for the typical themes and stories of peoplehood. She contends that many rural Wisconsinites see themselves as part of a distinct community that does not receive its, quote, fair share of decision-making power, clearly a political power theme, and that is, quote, that does not receive, quote, its fair share of public resources, an economic theme, and that is, quote, distinct from urban and suburban areas in their culture and lifestyle, a constitutive identity theme. These rural people believe they do more real hard work with their hands and backs, and that they are more moral, neighborly people, givers, not takers, in comparisons with those they see as urban elites who neither know nor care about their problems. Yet they feel they receive far fewer material rewards than city people do, and they often suffer active disdain as hicks and rednecks. Though their story of rural political peoplehood blends all three themes I have stressed, recently these Wisconsin citizens have most pressed their political power concerns, their beliefs that the governing officials, bureaucrats, and associated university experts in the Capitol and Madison give them no effective voice in the decisions shaping their lives. Partly as a result, they voted for Walker and Trump, who both told them they were right to feel aggrieved and who promised to be their champions against the elite objects of their resentment. To be sure, the grievances of rural populations against urbanites are nothing new in the U.S. or many other parts of the world. It's also certain that most rural Wisconsinites today still see themselves not just as rural people, but as Wisconsin citizens and U.S. citizens as well, among many other identities. Still, both the conversations Kramer reports and their recent voting behavior suggest that rural Wisconsinites' sense of themselves as having a distinct and unjustly treated political identity is far stronger than it has generally been in the past. Their rural political peoplehood is shaping and challenging their Wisconsin and American peoplehoods more than at many other times. There are good reasons for this. As Kramer notes, though many rural Wisconsin people choose to scapegoat groups for their problems who are not plausibly responsible for them, they do face real problems. It is a reality that in Wisconsin and in many other places, rural populations are a smaller share of the population and more distinct along many demographic dimensions from the growing numbers of city dwellers than they've ever been. At the same time, modern communication systems mean they are less isolated from those cities in the broader world than they've ever been, so that all the economic and cultural differences are in view. When they perceive people in power as, for example, designing educational curriculum and student transportation policies tailored to the social, economic, and logistical needs of suburban and urban populations, not to their distinctive rural needs, they are generally not mistaken. Those policies are not designed with them in mind. It is therefore not surprising that rural Wisconsinites are telling themselves stories and showing they can be mobilized by stories, portraying them as a distinct, virtuous, but wrongly neglected people. It is also not surprising that they cheer for narratives of Wisconsin and American citizenship in which they are central actors and central beneficiaries once more, stories that promise them that they can be great again. The rural-urban divide is, moreover, just one of innumerable axes around which distinct and conflicting senses of political peoplehood are now forming. As an avalanche of journalism and scholarship has shown, we live in an era of extraordinarily multifaceted identity politics. The players include social movements championing racial identities like Black Lives Matter and the American Indian movement, as well as communities of shared interest and identity defined by disabilities, sexuality, and other traits, sometimes defined as cultural, such as the deaf community and the LGBTQ community, along with a huge variety of traditional ethnic and immigrant groups. The participants in identity politics also include transnational political advocacy groups for workers, for environmentalists, for diaspora communities, for cosmopolitans favoring human rights and international justice institutions, as well as religious communities within and across national borders. Identity politics themes are also prominent in separatist regional movements like those in Cameroon, Catalonia, Chechnya, Corsica, Kurdistan, Nagorno-Karabakh in Azerbaijan, Scotland, Quebec, Transnistria in Moldova, and many other places. We should also not forget that many transnational corporations, some with gross revenues that exceed those of most states, constantly strive to foster strong senses of identity and allegiance in their employees, chiefly, but by no means exclusively, through economic stories. The conceptions they foster can mean that their people behave more as corporate loyalists than as national citizens. Google's cosmopolitan identity, for example, is clear on its website, which states, "Our mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful because the company is dedicated to creating opportunity for everyone." So the website heralds Google's endeavors in many lands. Most of these social movements, advocacy groups, cultural associations, religious communities, regional autonomy or separatism proponents, and multinational corporations convey, at least at times, the message that members should give their loyalties first and foremost to them, rather than to the frequently ineffective governments of the states they inhabit. They also deliver those messages far more rapidly, more widely, more frequently, and through more media than ever before. So they, too, contribute mightily to the cacophony of clashing stories of peoplehood that is, I suggest, increasingly the soundtrack of everyday life for most people around the world in the 21st century. Nor is there any longer any overarching global story of friends and enemies that provides order, structure, and stability to our multiple political identities in the way the Cold War once did. The ubiquity of concerns about terrorism throughout the world does not fill this gap. The great difference is that much of the world openly embraced communism once, while much of the rest of the world celebrated capitalism, creating a relatively clear, constant structure of identities and alliances on both sides. But today, virtually all states and peoples profess to oppose terrorism. They simply dispute vigorously and ceaselessly over which groups really are terrorists and which are instead valiant freedom fighters or noble servants of a holy cause. Even national states' designation of groups they oppose as terrorists or champion as heroes can shift rapidly. Witness Ronald Reagan's fervent praise and aid in the 1980s for the Afghani Mujahideen, who soon turned into the less beloved Taliban, as well as the early employment and aid the CIA provided to Saddam Hussein, later compared by former CIA Director George H.W. Bush to Hitler. All this means that few people can bring order to the clashing claims of political identities in the contemporary world by simply deciding whether they are, in the end, for or against terrorism, as they once could by deciding whether they were for communism or the self-proclaimed free world. People instead are engulfed by information about innumerable different kinds of political communities and associations, many of which advance claims on their allegiance, many of which do so in terms of appeals to identities that people feel they do possess and value, at least to some degree. So many people feel pulled and torn in different directions. As this clamorous chorus of political stories has accompanied the extensive economic and cultural transformations of recent years, transformations that often present real as well as imagined threats to people's economic livelihoods, social statuses, and valued ways of life, efforts to find footing on shifting ground have given rise to stridently nationalist forms of populism. For it remains true that the most dominant, most familiar stories of political peoplehood in the lives of all those who inhabit the world today are stories of nation states. They are stories that still resonate deeply with billions of people, even if their states appear all too ineffective, sometimes embattled, sometimes corrupt. They are stories that can readily be told with the simplicity, clarity, and authority that proponents of rival senses of political identity often can only achieve with great difficulty. It's also very easy to tell stories of the plight of many modern nation states in ways that assign blame for all of today's problems on the forces of economic globalization, on racial, ethnic, and religious minorities and immigrants, on everything and everyone that appears to be making the nation less than it is thought to once have been and less than its members would like it to be. And some, when we consider not only the ways that economic and cultural changes are constructing the landscape of contemporary politics, but also the ways that clashing stories of peoplehood are multiplying and how they are at the same time dividing us, we can better grasp the challenges we face. We can recognize why more pathological forms of populism, more narrowly nationalistic, racial, and religious, more exclusionary and repressive stories of who the people are and why they deserve to rule, are proving to have such broad and deep appeal in many parts of the world today. Based on that recognition, we can begin to form some ideas of how we can best respond to the concerns and aspirations that provide much of the power of these pathological populisms. Or at least that's what I'll try to show in the next two lectures. Sure, I'm happy to.
Students first.
There's a student.
Yeah, so you talked about identity politics, and I'm a bit confused how identity politics sort of paves the way for populism, because it seems that oftentimes identity politics will prioritize that cultural aspect over the economic aspect. And if both of those things are necessary for populism to arise, then how does identity politics sort of play into that?
Well, populist stories often feature a cultural identity that people present as embattled in one way or another. They often have anti-immigrant themes because they say the immigrants are transforming our traditional cultural identity. And they say they impose economic burdens and produce political problems as well. So here I agree with Jan Werner Müller. Populism is a form of identity politics. And that's why I think you need to pay attention to the story of who the people are. Yeah.
So would FDR have been a populist? It seems like the definition of elites versus people seems like it's maybe too minimal, in the sense that every political leader who's fighting against an established order will seek to mobilize the people as such, right? So that's one question I had. And so who is not a populist, basically?
Right.
And the second question is, why is nationalism such a powerful thing? Meaning, if there are so many other identities that you can presumably mobilize people on, why is it that this one identity is the one that people seem willing to fight and die for above all else?
Both excellent questions. In regard to the first, one reason that I don't like a very narrow definition of populism is that it can easily verge into a kind of denunciation of democracy, because you're absolutely right that every democratic leader claims to champion the people. Now, they don't always do it through a rhetoric of focusing on specific elites as the source of all evil in the way that the minimal definition of populist holds. FDR did. He attacked plutocrats, and that is a classic populist kind of appeal. But during the Cold War era, where there were calls for national unity against foreign enemies, that's a kind of national appeal. It isn't populist in this people versus elites theme. So that's distinguishable. Eisenhower didn't run on a populist platform. He ran on I like Ike, which is popular appeal, but he wasn't attacking an evil elite in the same way, although you're always criticizing your opponents to some extent. So the rhetoric can verge into that. So I think most democratic leaders have rhetoric that is at least part of the time populist rhetoric. That's why I'm worried that if we define populism as inherently bad, we are in danger of defining democracy as inherently bad, and I'm not ready to do that. Why does nationalism have the appeal that it does? I think that political identity, like all political identities, I think like all human identities, is significantly shaped by social and political institutions and forces over time, but in ways that become deeply entrenched so that second nature can become close to first nature for many people. And the late 20th century world was a product of a long historical development in which governments began to recognize each other as sovereign nation states in this Treaty of Westphalia kind of understanding of the way the world should be structured, as national states that gain their authority partly because they give recognition to other national states give it to them, and then domestically they create institutions of education, religion, socialization in many forms that foster a sense of national identity, and they've been doing it now for a long time in many parts of the world, so that if you grew up saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, as I did, you have fostered a sense of innate identity as an American citizen. And even in more recent ones, there's an awareness that the world is structured as this competition of nation states, and so it makes sense to be loyal to your team. And the social psychologists have shown over and over again that as soon as you tell people you're in this group and not that group, they seize on it. That's true for all identities, but national identities are ones where governments are telling them this is your team over and over and over again. It's a feature, part of my story as a Peoplehood claim is it's a feature of all political rhetoric that it says you are part of this people and you should be because this is what's good for you. And people hear these stories primarily as national stories more than any others. So that's why it's most powerful, but I don't think it'll necessarily always be that way. It hasn't always been that way and may not be that way forever. Those national stories are contested now, but my point is that people are pushing back, and precisely because so many people have been socialized in them, and it also just seems realistic that you have to value your nation-state identity to compete in the world, they have particular power. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you for the talk. So last year I heard another Rogers give a lecture on populism.
Rogers Brubaker.
That's right. and so his definition was more expansive, detailed, less minimalistic. And I just wanted to bring up two of the elements in definition, and because I'm wondering, if what we gain by having those is greater than by not having those, in being able to explain really populism. You mentioned that yourself in the beginning of the lecture. So I wanted to see what you think about two of his claims. I guess one is that populism is usually associated with, I think, what he called communicative low style. Trump is a clear example of that, but there are many others. And and another one is that he argued that that populism is an ideology that needs or seeks protection from above and from below. From above, meaning from these elites that you also mentioned. From below, meaning immigrants, right? So these are two elements that I thought, they're definitional in his view of populism, but they also help me understand a phenomenon, populism, that seems very vague, right? And so I wonder if what we gain analytically by having a few of these elements that Rogers Brubaker added is not worth it compared to a more minimalist definition like the one you or Oxford presented.
Well, it's worth thinking about, and I will think about it. I think it's true that most populist leaders speak in a kind of popular vernacular, whether they have a low communicative style. Is that the way you put it?
That's the way.
Yeah. I'm not sure that that's universally true. I don't think it's necessary. I do think it's an asset, but I do think FDR was populist in a lot of his rhetoric, and it wasn't in a low communicative style. The description of the immigrants as a threat from below, I would prefer to describe that as a threat from outside. Below assumes maybe populists see it that way, or some populists see it that way. But although I do think that there is a tendency of populist movements to be nativist, to be anti-immigrant, even that is a matter of degree. The American People's Party certainly did have a lot of native leaders who were suspicious of foreign labor, but at times they forged alliances with labor movements that consisted primarily of immigrant labor. And you think of Bernie Sanders today. I think Bernie deserves to be called a populist. I don't think his rhetoric is low, and I also don't think he's anti-immigrant. No. Well, I got to let other people in. I'm going to go over this side of the room now. Yeah.
I'd like to talk a bit about your second addendum, that we live in a post-colonial, post-Cold War, worldwide 21st century. And I wanted to ask you whether this is really kind of the important element to stress here when it comes to the clashes of different stories. Because I work on Weimar, and the problem of clashing stories there, and the historical situation was very different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think in many ways there are a lot of similarities when it comes to the clashes of narratives and the radicalization of those narratives. So could you say a little bit more about why you think that specific, our specific historical situation is special?
Well, I'd be likely to repeat what I just said, which is that you got, with the end of empires, a multiplication of new nations struggling for senses of identity, and with the end of the Cold War, again, a multiplication of new nations, and also less of the pressures of a world order that that compelled you to choose sides. I think those are distinct from the situation of Germany in the 20s and 30s, but I don't think that those circumstances are the only ones under which nationalist populist movements can arise. I think that Germany clearly was experiencing some specific circumstances of national humiliation and economic disaster that created conditions that led to the appeal of the Nazis and a strongman leader and all that. And that can happen in circumstances other than the ones we have today. So I'm not saying these are the only circumstances in which nationalist populisms arise, and there is some common denominator in periods of change and turmoil and sense of lost status and humiliation. I just think we weren't getting, we did get some fascist movements in a variety of countries. I'm not denying that in the 1930s, with the Depression contributing to the discrediting of capitalism. I just think that in the current moment, it's these most recent developments that help us understand what's happening now. Yeah.
So you make this interesting observation that the absence of hegemonic stories and the fragmentation, or at least the availability of a diverse set of central stories, is the cause of this. Where do you find the inspiration and the support for this? Is this these ethnographic accounts? Is it in the political psychology?
It's primarily in the ethnographic accounts. That's trying to look at what's happened through contextual analyses of different situations and adding them up. So I don't do social psychology experiments to explain it. I collect stories. Yeah.
I'm wondering about your comments on rural America. You said that in talking about the way that that kind of fit into your model of defining the elements of these kinds of populist stories, there's the political, economic, and constituent elements. You said rural America in what Kathy Kramer describes as more distinct and smaller than it's been before, which kind of makes it vulnerable to these types of new strident stories. But I'm kind of wondering, you said that modern technology makes those cultural and economic differences more visible. To what extent are those problems or those differences becoming more visible in the economic and cultural sense, and to what extent are they being kind of realistically exacerbated? So is there just a pattern of visibility that's the stronger factor here for those communities being kind of taken up with these narratives, or is there an increasing imbalance of political power that is also contributing to that vulnerability?
It's a question to which I don't have a confident answer, except to say I'm pretty sure both things are going on, and which has the relative greater weight is a subject for empirical investigation that I'd certainly like to see. In some circumstances it may be one, in some circumstances it may be another. That is to say, some groups may be seriously disempowered, other groups not so disempowered, but they're getting a lot of messages that still upset them. And so I can't give a confident answer, but I think it's a question worth exploring. Yeah.
So you focused a lot on the late 20th and early 21st century in very interesting ways. I was wondering...
Hey, I started with Neanderthals.
So I was wondering whether I should think of the late 18th century and early 19th century United States as a federal society, or federal Mexico at that time, as sort of fitting with this framework of competing stories of peoplehood, and was there a cacophony at that time, or was it just like there's two stories, one is state identity versus a national identity, or is that something that you think is different from the framework that you've proposed today?
I think that there is an interweaving of state and nation building that doesn't always go the same way in all times and places. That sometimes there is a construction of a sense of national identity that then seeks a state more often, I think, there's an effort to construct a state that then tries to foster a sense of national identity. And there's a lot of excellent literature on how states tried to foster senses of national identity, from peasants into Frenchmen, Britons by Linda Colley, who used to be here. And there are a number of works that show how, with the rise of the nation states, states were trying to foster a sense of national identity. And that was often contested. There was certainly cacophony. There's certainly resistance. Not all that resistance has gone away, and much of it is being revived by separatist movements now. Nation and state building always incomplete. But we're under circumstances, in some circumstances favored those nation building enterprises. Now we're under circumstances that work against those state-led nation building enterprises. But again, the circumstances that challenge those are also unsettling to people in ways that give nationalist leaders opportunities to push back by saying we need state policies that foster a sense of common identity. And we'll see tomorrow that a lot of people's response to issues of immigration are reluctantly to say, well, we really do need to assimilate them into a sense of national identity more effectively than we're doing. I don't know if that's an adequate answer or not, but.
So this was great. I can't wait for the next 2 episodes. I do have 2 questions, and this first one is this idea of the cacophony of stories. I really like the figure because it speaks to, for example, this idea of fake news, right? This displacement of truth and trying to grasp for something and finding it in this outrageous headline that my 66-year-old aunt just shared, right? I want to know, does that tie to it in this? Is the fact that fake news are sort of symptomatic of this narrative being imposed, does that mean that maybe just saying, oh, they're not true is not enough? And maybe the way to do it is to say, it's not just enough to provide a graph saying, well, this is false, but rather a counter-narrative. So that's sort of one topic. And the second one is you brought up Ernesto Laclau's definition of populism, which is interesting because he doesn't define populism as an ideology as much as a sort of an ethos in the language of rhetoric, right? To the extent that every single identity, like you pointed out, can have those sort of anti-liberal, anti-democratic sense. So to what extent do you agree with him with your sort of thin definition?
So on the first point, I do think that technology is contributing to a situation of enabling fragmentation and polarization through creation of echo chambers and so forth, as many have argued. I think that's true. I don't like using technology as the driving causal explanation because I think technology is always what we do with it, but we can't entirely control what we do with it. I accept that. But rather than blame technology, I do go in the direction of counter-narratives, just as you were suggesting. Fundamentally, I think I'm in agreement with Laclau that you can have a populist way of structuring and presenting and seeing politics tied to a whole wide range of particular policies. Does that mean it's not an ideology? Well, I would say as the kind of common denominator, you might say it's not an ideology. But again, every particular populist movement does have its own story of the people, of their grievances, of their aspirations and worth. And so in that sense, populism may be a characteristic that is true of a family of ideologies and not an ideology itself, but you won't understand any particular populist movement unless you look at their ideology. Yeah.
I had a question about the sort of temporal dimension of your argument and what's happening in the post-Cold War world itself, right? Like, is there maybe an inflection point surrounding something that's happened in that 20-year period that might be also contributing to this growing number of voices and thinking, you know, the global financial crisis or failure of consensus on neoliberalism or global intellectual
Yeah, I think those are definitely right. A lot of those go into arguments about the economic causes of our current condition, and I didn't go through all those, but again, it's not because I challenged them, it's because a lot of other people are going through them. And I do think that in the post-Cold War world, we had the rise of the kind of economic institutions and policies exercising power that people call neoliberal, and that they helped some people and didn't help or actively hurt a whole lot of others, and that helped create the conditions for populist movements. I don't think it's the whole story, but I also think it definitely is part of the story, including some quite legitimate grievances that Trump spoke to and that populist leaders in other countries have spoken to. Yeah.
I would like to have a 2-hour conversation with you, as you're lucky that your time is almost up today. Will you be here for a few days?
I'm here all week. Try the veal. Yeah. This is the first of 3 lectures here. The next couple days, I'm in town. So.
All at this time, like this?
Yes.
4 to 5:30 tomorrow and the next day.
Good.
Yes.
I have a question, but I don't have enough allowance from the moderator to be able to ask all of it. I hope you get on the stage and that you compose a Hamilton rendition of your talk. It would be so educational, and put it to music into an opera, and it'll be so educational to everybody who comes to New York City to hear you. Wouldn't you love to do that? Because very few people understand what you do, let alone are able to articulate it and to enunciate it too. Thank you.
Wow.
Well, thank you. But as far as a musical is concerned, as Clint Eastwood once remarked, a man's got to know his limitations. Yeah, if you can interest Lin-Manuel Miranda, I'm all for it. Yeah.
Is there a question in back? Oh, thanks.
So I appreciate the fact that you don't want to turn a critique of populism into a critique of democracy. I think I share that, although I must say it's tested. Tested in recent years. But what is left out of the definition, even of the minimal definition, which you call anti-elitism, I would say populism also has a distinctive anti-institutionalism. And it's that threat to the rule of law that I think is what's disturbing about populism. It's sort of missed in this anti-elitism. It's the sense that we as the people, as a group identity, trump institutions and trump the law. And, excuse the expression. And I'm wondering, what is the place of institutions in your definition of populism, in your sense of the problem of populism?
I understand the concern, and I think it's certainly true that there are populist movements in the world today that use constitutional forms, but really simply to impose their will in a way that defies rule of law, as I referred to briefly. I also understand that there is at least the potential in populist ideology that people are the source of all legitimacy. You can use that to overrun all sorts of procedural barriers, processes, and structures, and so it can be anti-institutional in that sense. I'm not persuaded that that is inherent in populism. You know, I do refer back to the American People's Party, which was a relatively short-lived and an imperfect political phenomenon, and it got worse over time, and I'm conscious of all that. But at the same time, although they had some proposals that seemed radical at the time and later came to be adopted, and some that genuinely were pretty radical, they really saw themselves as true to the Constitution and were open, engaged in debates about constitutional limits of powers and structures that I think they took seriously. I see the danger that populism can disregard institutions in the name of the people's will. It's a real danger. Whether we should make that a definition, part of the definition of populism, I'm reluctant to accept. Maybe eventually I'll have to accept it. So.
Anybody who hasn't already asked a question?
Here, she hasn't asked yet.
Okay. You're next.
Okay.
You're first.
Yeah, you're first. Sort of a philosophical question about if you are an optimist or a pessimist. I find this really bleak, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow. But do you have a sense, okay, how can I say this? Is there any hope that in terms of our identities in the world and identifying ourselves in opposition to others, that intersectionality, is there any hope, does any hope lie there in terms of people seeing themselves and their people, whoever their people are, as having a whole web of identities? Is that hopeful, or is that going to lead just to more fragmentation? I mean, is there any hope that other than, I almost hear you saying, maybe I'm mishearing, that during the Cold War at least we had something to identify ourselves, something clear that people can identify themselves against, and now there's so many competing identities. Are you hopeful, or are you pessimistic about, we've gone from Neanderthals to, yeah.
So the web of identities phrase is close to one that I will use tomorrow. So, what I'd say is I think that there is a solid basis for hope, but no guarantees. And so, it's up to us to take things in a better rather than worse direction, and I do think it's possible, but I don't think it's by any means inevitable. We're in very tough times now, and it wouldn't be intellectually honest to pretend otherwise. But I don't think it's hopeless, and I do think it requires something that's very demanding, and this is what we'll be talking about, that we're not going to get such an easy story of us versus them as we had in the Cold War. We have to get people used to accepting some more complicated stories in which they have multiple identities and allegiances, but they also share things with multiple different groups. And the challenge of telling these more complicated stories in ways that people don't find unduly confusing, unsettling, or threatening, that's the challenge. But I do think it can be done, and I'll throw out an example now that I don't want to pursue in great depth because it's a very troubled one right now, but I was at a conference in Europe where they were debating the fate of the European Union and saying there's no common sense of European identity and strong enough to compel allegiance, and we're seeing lots of evidence that that's true. At the same time, a lot of people argued that the young people in Europe had grown up in a world in which they could routinely cross what used to be national borders that were hard to cross, and many of them found it inconceivable that they would give this up. And that means that they thought of their identity as both national and European in at least some important respects, and were comfortable with that. And I think that there are ways of trying to build support for these more complicated multiple senses of identity. After all, we all already do have complicated multiple senses of identity, and we just need a politics that helps us think that that's comfortable and not a danger.
That's sort of hopeful.
Yeah.
Should we And on that note,
We could very well end on that. We have 90 seconds, so this means it would have to be a 90-second question or comment.
He's got a short one.
This is gonna
I mean,
be
30
a 90,
seconds.
it's gonna be a 90-second proof of your comment.
Oh, well, make it 30 so he's got
I'm gonna make it
60
30
seconds.
if
Okay.
we continue. I'm a young European. In our home right here, we have a European Union flag on our wall next to the Greek and the Danish and the UK one.
That's
So
lovely.
just
That's lovely.
the next generation can change.
But you had a hand up. We'll let you get the last word.
I was wondering if you think that Cold War identity was based more on an identity against something or an identity for something?
Either kind of identity can work, and I'd say for different people at different times it was more one than another. But it is unfortunately true that often the most politically effective one is one that demonizes your opposition rather than offers a positive vision of yourself. But I like to note that even demonizations of opposition, of opponents, can be overcome in some circumstances. Buffy the Vampire Slayer reached peace with some that had been demonized because they actually were demons. But nonetheless, they managed to find some common ground.